Well, Plato's pure forms, he's thinking of them in terms of thought, of course. I mean, how else can one think but in terms of thought? So, in his thought, there is an essence or a purity of any particular value, sort of thought that he values. In the world, of course, it's complicated by the fact that the world is an interrelationship of everything affecting everything else, everything being causally linked to the things around it according to their qualities. So one can think of honesty in a pure sense, for instance. And then one can think of circumstances in which honesty is disastrous, as where you're telling an enemy where your weaknesses are. So in the practicalities of the material, things are not as simple, though there is a purity in the mind. So one ends up with not so much iron rules of application in the world, but pure forms that influence and guide in the real world, but not more than that. Or at least, should I say, you can't necessarily stick to a particular pure form when it's manifested in creation, the material world, in other words, because the material world is accommodating, if you like, the pressure of all the forms upon it. And the pure forms that you have in mind well, the complex of them is not consistent, whereas in the world there is always a consistency. The world functions according to causal relationships. So you may have miscalculated in the pure form world, the thought world, how well you could stick to a particular conceived principle or value. But when it comes to what we call reality, the material world, you find is inconsistent with other pure forms that you have. This forces you, in terms of the thought world, to revise when a particular pure form is appropriate and when it's not. So we might find that loyalty is greatly prized in our mind because of certain advantages we've seen in the material world when you keep to loyalty. But then there are circumstances in the material world where loyalty is not ideal at all. You know, it's best to overcome the evil dictator that's destroying life and your family and the other things that you value. So you now have a thought form that says the ideal government is so-and-so, and in those circumstances one is loyal. Where this is not the case, the ideal circumstance is an effective rebellion that removes the problem. So you've now built up a sort of thought form which is values that are more appropriate when you come to entering the material world. And you must do that, because if you don't accommodate the material world in your thought forms, you don't survive, and you're no longer in the game, so to speak. Those that are in the game are those that do make provision in the thought forms such that those forms are consistent with the demands of the material world. So I don't think jon17 is really quite right when he thinks that philosophers like Plato were sort of Persian plant to corrupt the enemy, Greece in this case, just like the pirates were planting Mithraism in effect as a way of overcoming their Roman enemies later in the historic scene. I suppose, though, I've got in the back of my mind I want to be very loyal to Plato, in that he was reading Plato was a sort of foundation of my impression upon my values of the value of philosophy and reasoning and logical discourse and so forth. And I felt there was something very genuine in that. If I reflect on what I mean by genuine, I mean that logic and reasoning seem to be the most reliable way, I suppose, of surviving in the real world, and it being, and life, physical life and so on, being what we would call good. In other words, it gave a way of life that would make life a lot better for us. For myself, in studying and making my way in the world, I suppose you could say, in a sort of worldly sense. Was devotion to the Platonic way of things, reasoning and philosophy, something spiritual? I felt that it was. I was never au fait with really understanding about pure forms and so on. I didn't see the link that pure forms was another way of thinking of thought, another way of conceiving of what thought was. And when it was sort of become clearer to me that he was interested in pure forms, I was thinking of it in terms of there's another world in which there is beauty, there is honesty, there is faith, there is goodness. And you might think of that as heaven. And he might think of it in terms of, is it the illusion fields, the life of prosperity and plenty in a beautifully natural form. Heaven, really. But that would not have grabbed me. That would have been far too non-practical and alien to what I conceived philosophy to be, but not quite what he thought, because clearly he was referring to the gods and so on, and well, all that would have been just make-believe, and I found that very strange. It was not what I was expecting in philosophy. And I guess I just looked past that, ignored it, because I was so impressed with rationality, in fact. And I felt that's what he was, the expert, the teacher in rationality and discourse, rational discourse. But now, looking at life from a different point of view, where in the extreme, I find the thought world more real and more relevant than the material world. That in some sense our being is in thought, not in the material. What we're doing and what we seem to be, but what we're thinking and conceiving of, and really speaking, what we are experiencing, which is thoughts. The environment is there, of course, out there, external to us, to the body, if you like. But we're only experiencing that environment in terms of the thoughts that it generates in us. And it's these thoughts that are the real world of our living, the reality that we're having to cope with. So that the real world can be a certain way, but we're interpreting it in different possible ways. And some of those interpretations are prosperity in terms of how we then relate to the real world. But some of those conceptions of the real world are a disaster in terms of how we're relating to that real world. And the obvious being, of course, the person who gets so discouraged that they harm themselves by addiction and even direct suicide. And one would say, well, that's harmed your physical well-being and takes you out of the game. Does that mean being in the game is of more priority than what's happening in the thought world? No, because your thought world is what you're really experiencing. And if that experience is bad, you're going to eclipse yourself. Okay, so why is suicide so bad? Oh, because it ends, I would now say in my conceptual thought world, it ends your possibility of achieving what you should have achieved here, in life, in this universe, which I conceive of as you should ideally achieve a state of pure forms within that are consistent with heaven, such that you're no threat there, but on the contrary, a great blessing. And so you needn't return to the world. And in those circumstances, well, it's good that you exit the game, because the game was for a purpose. It was to teach you. Well, having graduated, there's no need to remain. I don't mean you then top yourself. I mean, according to the Jesus story, you're now equipped to be sent, and you are sent, and you bring this blessing to others. Well, until God takes you. To live is Christ, to die is gain. It's all joy to you in your thought conception of your being, and now your thought conception of your eternal being. Now, if in some sense God is more thought than material being, he makes the material universe, but that's not what he is. He's the maker. He's the thought man behind it. If we're trusting that he is eternal and we are in harmony with him, then rationally we're eternal too. Or to put it more simplistically, as children of God, we are of him. If he is eternal, and especially if he's all-powerful, well then so are we. Assuming he loves his children. And of course, one of our pure thoughts and views is, well, of course, a parent loves his own. They are his very self. And this is our experience in the material world. So it's become one of our thought forms. So the Jesus story builds upon a foundational thought form that's in all of us. For if we're in this world, it's because we've received parenting, not necessarily from mum and dad. It may have been from auntie or a kind foster lady, and so on. Or even a kind uncle or brother who took us under his wing and cared for us. Now, I've seen students at school that are like that. I think of one poor soul who, well, we thought she wasn't being cared for, but it was because the care was really her older brother. And of course he was not an experienced adult, but he was doing his best, dear boy. Where mum and dad were coming short in that respect, I guess. And one thought, what a fine man. My sort of landlady here too is similar. Her mum left herself and a 1 year younger brother when she was 3. And he looked upon her as his mum, in effect. What a wonderful lady to have achieved that from childhood. Gosh, that so impresses our thought forms, doesn't it? Same as this boy who was looking after his younger sister, the best he could. Not as able as an adult might be able to do so, but with what he had. Bless him, dear man, dear boy. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for this fantastic experience of the material life. That we should be here, perhaps, simply to mature. That we may be with you in heaven forever, life eternal, by your grace and loving kindness. So, in the pure form that we have in our minds of parenthood, we conceive of you, dear friend, as dear friend, as dearest parent, divine mother, Heavenly Father. And Jesus takes it as Heavenly Father, perhaps. Perhaps that's foundational because mum can't even be her best if she doesn't have some help from her lovely husband, the knight in shining armour, that comes to rescue her in her need. Wow. So you build on this thought form in our mind, this pure form, and it's a firm foundation, it seems. It seems one of the best, at least, Lord. And we just thank you for this. magnificent story of Jesus, and it may have got edited and tarnished over the years, and perhaps it wasn't in pure form to begin with. It took time to be polished up, and we're still doing that by your grace and goodness. For this is life eternal, to come to know you better and better. Wonderful one, dearest, dearest Heavenly Dad, we so love you, so love you, Heavenly Dad. Thank you, Dad.